Okay. Okay, very good. We're all set up. We're connected, I believe. Let me make sure my mic is connected. It looks like it is. It looks like the sound's coming in well. Um, Whoever's in a position where they can turn on their cameras, that definitely would create more of a feeling of being in person, even though we're not. And I will just check that we're ready to start. We'll get the class going any minute. Welcome, David. Okay, so yeah, it would be a pleasure to see your faces. There we go. Able to take the class, sort of like a round table. Whoever's on video, just give me a thumbs up. Is my mic coming in okay? Awesome, amazing. That was the one thing I was concerned about with all this tech leading into the class. Perfect. As long as the mic's okay, I think we're good to go. So we can jump right into it. We'll start with so there's a waiting room here. I actually want to change the settings so that people could join automatically. I'm not sure I know how to. So we might just have to admit everyone manually. Okay, so we'll jump into it. There's a story you might have heard. Stories told of an atheist who was on a hike.
Rabbi, just one. Rabbi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. If you can spotlight your video, okay? Because like in YouTube, you see many people. So if you can go to participant and you can spotlight your video.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Spotlight. There we go. There we go. Now we have everything set up properly. Okay, so the story you might have heard. There's an atheist. He's out hiking, and he's done the trail before. Nothing too crazy. He feels confident. His belief system isn't being questioned, and he's on a hike, regular day as usual. When an accident happens, a freak accident, he sort of slips. He was around the cliff, and he's going down. He's falling down, and at this point, all his beliefs up until this point is out the window. It's sort of, he's worried for his life, and so he's clawing. He's reaching out, trying to grab on anything, trying to save himself, and halfway down, but he's pretty high up, and it would be dangerous to continue falling. He grabs onto a branch, and he's holding himself up, and he's able to hold himself, and he feels it's been a miracle and he's been saved, but he's still stuck. What else can he do at this point? So feeling that it was a miracle that saved his life, he starts whispering, but to God, and he says, I haven't been faithful. I haven't ever turned to you before, but this is a moment where I feel like I could use your intervention. Thank you for giving me this branch. And I could use your help forward, because right now I'm stuck and I don't know where to go from here. And so he's whispering and making prayers and a commitment to potentially being more religious, and says, God, I'm gonna start studying whatever it is you want from me. There has to be a purpose to my life. I'm not ready for it to end yet, and I'm gonna study. and I'm going to bring others closer to you. And I have connections and I have people, and I'm going to start spreading the word. And please, God, if there's anything you could do at this moment to get me down from this branch that I'm hanging onto for dear life. And at that very moment, he hears what can only be described as a godly voice. He hears this booming voice that says, "My son, I heard your prayers. Wow, God, this is exciting." And so let's call him an ex-atheist at this point. He says, "God, please, what is it you could do to help me? I'm your servant from here on out. What is it that what can you do to help me down this branch?" And so God says, "Do you trust me?" And the man goes, "God, of course I trust you. My life's in your hands. Of course I trust you." And God asks, "I need to ask you again, do you trust me?" And the man goes, "Yes, God, I trust you. Please just help me down." And God says, "I'm going to need you to let go of that branch. That branch that you're holding on to, I need you to let go." We have an alarm going here. Okay, I should check what the alarm is. There we go. Okay, we'll take it from here. So he's hanging on to the branch, and God says, "Do you trust me?" And he says, "Yes, God, I trust you fully." And God says, "I need you to let go of that branch. Let yourself go, and I'll save you." And so the man thinks about it, and he's hesitant, and he's struggling, and he looks heavenward and says, "Is there anyone else up there?" And that's the end of that story. The moral being, God gives us blessings. We're all familiar with that in one way or another. And there is a discussion to be had about how we receive those blessings. And that is something that I want to discuss in this class. Now, let's dive right into the parsha and how this is going to connect. So the parsha is devarim. Devarim means the words. These are the words of Moshe. We're beginning a new book. These are the 5 books that create the Chumash. We're beginning a new book, the book of Devarim. What's interesting about it, and what's found in its name, it's the words of Moshe, is that it sets itself apart from the previous 4 books. And a lot of it is repetition. You start looking through it, we're going to have the 10 Commandments again. We're going to have a lot of the narratives and the stories repeated, a lot of repetition. Very few new mitzvot. There are some, but very few. So it's really mostly repetition, Moshe's words, a lot of encouragement, a lot of what you'd expect from a leader, really like emphasizing, stay strong, keep the mitzvot, there'll be blessings, keep the mitzvot, a lot of encouraging, stay truthful to God. So sort of a whole book that's full of that. And what's interesting is that it really is the words of Moshe versus the earlier, everything we're going to say now, there's a long quote, there's a long quotation marks. You got to put the first marks before really by the second verse, because it starts off with introduction. These are the words of Moshe, and then the second verse, according to some interpretations, is already his words. So you got to put the first marks over there and then go through the end of the book. Well, almost the end of the book, because the end of the book is Moshe's passing. And it's this long quote, it's this long speech, if you would have it. And the entire book is just that. It's Moshe's words. And so that itself requires some examination, which we'll discuss. What is the purpose of Moshe's words? A very simple, basic question. We've had God's words until now. Are we equating Moshe's words to God's words? It's all in the Torah. Are we seeing it as different? And what's the purpose if so much of it is repetition? So that's something we'll get to. What I'd like to focus on more specifically, so we have verse 11, where it's a blessing. And this is what we just started discussing about blessings. Verse 11, right in the beginning. And Moshe gives a blessing. He says, God, the God of your ancestors, will multiply your number 1,000 times. He will bless you as he told you he would when he took Avram outside his tent and showed him the stars. So Moshe says, God will give you a blessing 1,000 times. You will proliferate 1,000 times over what you are now. And you'll have the blessing that God gave you. Now, this verse itself seems to be split into two. The first half is Moshe saying, he's giving a number. He's saying you'll be blessed 1,000 times. It's quite a generous blessing, but nonetheless, there seems to be some definition to it, 1,000 times blessing. And then he continues, and you'll get the blessing that God gave you. Why that repetition? Why does he say the blessing 1,000 times and the blessing God gave you? Well, what is the blessing God gave them? So I was using a little bit of a cheat code. I'm using the Chumash that already brings in parentheses in the translation what it's referring to. It's referring to the blessing to Avram, referring to the blessing that Avram got at the time of the covenant. And so this is all the way back, one of the first stories of Genesis in Bereshit. And the blessing there is that the Jewish people, quite a famous blessing, that the Jewish people will be as large and multiply like the stars of the heaven and like the sands near the sea. And just like they can't be counted, the Jews too will be without number. And so a blessing that the Jews will be so vast that it would be impossible to count. Something like an unlimited blessing. So that really is what's happening in this verse, where there's two halves to Moshe's blessing. He says, I'm giving you this blessing of you'll increase 1,000-fold, and God will fulfill his blessing that he has blessed you to be so numerous as to not be counted. There is a story to this blessing. And we actually find this theme a lot through this book of devarim, where it's Moshe speaking, but a lot of what he's speaking is also a conversation with the Jewish people. And it takes the commentators who will fill in the blanks of what the Jewish people told Moshe, and therefore how he responded in his dialogue. So what's the story that the Medrash tells us behind this blessing? It really is that the Jewish people started complaining. The Jewish people heard that Moshe gave them a blessing of, I bless you 1,000-fold, and they said, hey, that's not fair. We were blessed by God to be so numerous as to not be counted. And you're coming here and limiting it. You're only giving us 1,000-fold when we've been promised the world and beyond. And so they were complaining. They said that this is not, we won't settle for your blessing. And so Moshe said, I'm giving you my blessing 1,000-fold, and God will give you his, that he has already promised you. I'm not taking away from God's blessing. He promised you unlimited, without number, cannot be counted. That will still happen. God will give you his blessing. I will give you mine of 1,000-fold. And so we already start seeing here the first seeds. And this is the discussion I want to have about there somehow is this dichotomy of Moshe speaking. It's the word of God, because otherwise it wouldn't be the Torah. But he's saying, this is my message and this is God's message. My message is 1,000, God's message is unlimited. So there's so many questions to be asked on this. How did the two messages work together? Another question to be asked is, if we are blessed by God, then what's Moshe's role in the picture? If we have unlimited blessings, why do we need 1,000-fold? But yeah, really that larger picture question of the whole book, where it comes to Moshe's word, which Moshe's word, he's somehow trying to add onto God's word, but yet somehow limiting it. What is the purpose of this entire book and of Moshe? And if we're making the question larger, what's the purpose of Jewish leaders? And how does that find its way into the Torah? So let us start by so the question, though, that will be addressed right now will be, once we have the blessing of God with unlimited, without limit, what then is the purpose or the utility of a blessing of 1,000-fold? That's the question that the classic commentators ask on this medrash, and that's where we could start building our case. And so the first answer that's given is that we find that blessings of God are many times conditional. We have this later in the book of Devarim, V'haya im shemaya tishma'u. It will be when you listen to my voice, you listen to the commandments, you heed my commandments, then I will give you the blessings, and you'll have your food, and you'll have your lands will be blessed. So it's conditional. We find that God's blessings are conditional, and there's other verses as well which bring across the same point, that if you heed God's commandments, then he will bless you. That being the case, we can understand that potentially Moshe was actually being generous. He said, God has given you his blessing, this unlimited, boundless blessing, this unlimited, boundless blessing, but it's only if you're a tzaddik. It's only if you listen to what God wants you to do. I, as a leader, am actually going to add to that. I'm actually going to give you a blessing of what I'm capable of 1,000-fold, that the Jewish people should proliferate 1,000-fold, and it's unconditional. So it has its utility. It has its purpose. God's blessing is only in effect when the Jewish people are truly living up to who they are as God's children. But Moshe came along and said, I want to be generous. I want to give you more. I want to make sure you're always taken care of, not only when you make the right choices. And therefore, I am electing to use my power or my position as a godly man, as a prophet, as a man of God, to give you the blessing 1,000-fold, even when you aren't to be following the conditions, the rules and regulations. So that's one answer given by the classic commentators. So that's a nice answer. We could understand now the utility of Moshe's blessing. I'd like you to take us to another answer. And this answer is actually stated in one of the versions of the Medrash. This is potentially for a class about the history of the oral Torah and how these books work, but the Medrash has many versions. And in one of the versions of the Medrash, where it says how the Jewish people complained that Moshe was only giving them 1,000-fold and God promised them this boundless blessing, it actually adds to it. It adds to it this sort of a parable. And in classic midrashic imagery, it conjures the image of the palace. We always go back to this image of the palace and the king and the Jewish people being the prince or the princess. And in this story, the king had to leave and his son wasn't yet responsible. And he had to leave, the king had to leave his possessions, his boundless possessions, with someone. But he didn't feel like his son was yet responsible. He said, if I give it to him, he's going to waste it. He's not going to use it responsibly. It's going to be gone before we know it. And so therefore, he appointed an overseer, a caretaker, to look over his entire empire of possessions. Anyway, the prince reaches, and this is in the Medrash, the Medrash continues the tale, that the prince reaches a place of understanding. He began to understand that he was the prince from this royal family with all this wealth, and he began demanding that the wealth be given to him. He said, he comes to the caretaker and says, you are holding all this wealth, you have it under lock and key, and I want it. It's my right. And so the caretaker hears what he has to say, and the next day, or a little bit after, approaches him and gives him a limited amount of possessions. And the way the Medrash writes it, it's enough for him to make a living, enough for him to set out on his own. Now, the prince is outraged, and he goes, this is all the gold and silver of my father's palace. And so the caretaker said, listen, what I've given you is of my own. I've given you from my own possessions. I've dug into my own pocket. I've heard that you want to set out on your own and you'd like to have your own possessions. So I've dug into my own pocket, my own bank, and given you possessions so that you could start off. That's my favor to you. What your father has stored away for you, that's stored away until the time is right. Now, the Medrash using this story in our context, how then do we apply it? It seems to be implying that God's boundless blessing is stored away for a future time. How then could we understand this? The times that this is referring to, the times of Mashiach. There's a future time in which we'll be hit with this boundless blessing that God has stored for us. this is the time when we will fulfill the verses of proliferating to a degree where we can't be counted, like the stars and the sand. And until then, we don't have that blessing. We truly are limited in number. And on the contrary, in exile, we're constantly referred to as a small nation, a minority amongst the nations. We don't have that vastness in number. We don't have that blessing. And so God's blessing is stored away until the times of Mashiach. And now we understand, comes along the caretaker being Moshe, and he says, I'm going to give you of my own. I'm able to dig into my own pockets, so to speak, and say, until the times of Mashiach, you'll still receive a blessing 1,000-fold. So again, we've reached an understanding of the utility of Moshe's blessing. So I'm just going to quickly summarize two classic answers to this question of, if you have the unlimited blessing of God, why do you need this blessing that's so defined by number, this 1,000-fold blessing of Moshe? The first answer we gave from the classic commentators was that God's blessing is conditional, whereas Moshe chose to add an unconditional blessing. The second answer is that God's blessing is stored away until the times of Mashiach. And Moshe said, until the times of Mashiach, I will give you my blessing, bestow upon you my blessing, that you will proliferate 1,000-fold. So far, so good. That's the entry into this discussion. But in order to take this one step further, we do have to take a little bit of step back and try creating a new perspective on this topic. And this will lead us back into where we want to go with our understanding of the leader and Moshe and the entire book of devarim ultimately. So taking a step back, if we would look at the blessing that God gives, the blessing that God promises to Avraham, right? He promises him that the Jewish people will be like the stars of the heaven that can't be counted. They'll be like the sand of the earth that can't be counted, and they won't have a number. That's God's words. It reads very allegorical. It reads metaphorical. And it almost obviously has to be understood as being a metaphor. The Jewish people, as long as we're discussing the physical realm, in the spiritual realm of souls, potentially we could speak of things in an unbounded, without limit sort of way within the spiritual realms. And we do say there's no limit to how many angels there are. It's hard for us to fathom, but there's such a concept of the unlimited. But within the physical realm, the very concept of unlimited doesn't really exist. Every Jew is a child of someone. They have their family, their size, the size of their family. They have the time that they're alive. They have the place that they're occupying, the space that they're in. The very concept of being unlimited as a nation in this physical world isn't really possible. And therefore, the simple reading of the Torah is not that God's exaggerating, but that it's metaphorical. And we're using the allegory, we're using the example allegorically of the stars. The stars, do they really not have number? I'm sure there is a limit to the number of the stars. I don't know if the human knowledge, if we're fully knowledgeable of all, and we're still discovering, but there is a limit. The stars, there isn't an unlimited amount of stars. Anything within this physical universe has limit, and especially so when we discuss the sand. The stars are potentially part of a vaster universe. We might not know everything. The sand that we have on Earth, it's quite difficult to count the particles of sand, but there is a limit. We could be talking in an extraordinary amount of numbers to a point where it wouldn't be counted, but it can be counted. It's not unlimited is the point. And so therefore, we're understanding the blessing of God as being metaphorical. And what he's really saying is, just as there's so much sand that you wouldn't take the time to count it, there'll be so many Jews that it would be silly to create a census. The governments wouldn't be creating a census of the amount of Jews because there's so many, and it's beyond the realm of what we usually take count of. But the fact that it's unlimited seems to not really be the meaning of what God was saying. So let's just take that as the first step of sort of the simple meaning of God's blessing, that it's metaphorical, and we're gonna proliferate vastly. Moshe, let's look about his blessing and see how limited was it really. So he says, you will grow 1,000-fold. How many Jews were there then? The Jews then, we only have a number of the Jews between the age 20 and 60, men. Men between the age 20 and 60 were counted. We know that there were 600,000. That's the rough number, was 600,000. Let us say that to every man there's a woman. Let's just put that equal. Sometimes in population it's 51 to 49%, but let's just make that equal. We're at over 1 million. We're at 1,200,000. Let's talk about those who lived past the age of 60, and that doesn't seem so foreign then. Moshe lived up to the age of 120. In the desert, they were passing away due to a specific decree, but those that left Egypt, they could have been much older, having left Egypt. So I think you have to assume, if we're saying that there's 600,000 men of this age, I think it would be fair to assume that children under 20 and over 60, this is actually quite a minimal assumption. Let's say 80,000. Anyway, we've led our number to 2 million. That's where we're at. We're at 2 million, and that's the least. And I can't do this math offhand, but if you would do 1,000 times 2 million, are we at? I can't do the math offhand, but that's definitely a large number.
2 billion.
2 billion. Okay. So we're at 2 billion. And that's the math of what Moshe's blessing was at the very least. At the very least, he was promising them that they will proliferate to the number of 2 billion. Taking it even a step further, the Medrash, a different Medrash, but again, the Medrash is quite a large book. It points out that the wording used is not God will bless you elef pa'am, 1,000 times, rather elef pa'amin, which means thousands of times. So not to the tune of 1,000, but to the tune of thousands more. So if our starting point is billions, and then continue adding on that, the number that Moshe was given for the nation that was going to be is quite a large number. So while this is quite technical and down to the details, we are trying to show that Moshe's blessing wasn't all that limited. It was quite a large nation. And if you want to look at what is the size of a nation in which we stop taking a census, in which in those days would be way beyond anyone's vision of what a nation can be, I think in the billions is a fair assessment to say, yeah, this is beyond, this is a fulfillment of God's promise that will be beyond number. If we're at a point where every nation, and then we're talking each nation was local, every nation, we're not at all in the realm of billions, and we're talking that there's going to be a nation that will proliferate to the tune of billions, that's the fulfillment of God's blessing that we will be beyond number. And so really, all of this is to say that Moshe and God were actually, technically, promising the same thing. That being the case, why were the Jewish people complaining? So it's an old stereotype, if we may. As Jews, we're allowed to make fun that the Jewish people, that we're always complaining. They say that at a kosher venue, the wait staff, when they're being trained, they're told that if they're serving a non-Jew, if they're serving a Gentile, when they approach, they should ask, hey, is everything okay with your order? Right? Is everything okay with your order? And they're told that when they approach a Jewish table, they should ask, hey, is anything okay with your order? But that's biblically, there's precedent to that stereotype that the Jewish people, we find a way to complain. We complained about the food from heaven. We complained about that we weren't getting meat. We complained whenever there wasn't water, although that sounds more valid, not having water. We complained we missed the cucumbers that we ate when we were in Egypt. We kind of liked being slaves. So biblically, that stereotype does seem to hold up. And the Jewish people here as well were complaining. They said, God told us unlimited, and you told us thousands of times. What exactly were they? What upset them? If Moses' blessing and God's blessing seem to line up just from the raw numbers perspective. And so it's here that I'd like to introduce a Hasidic perspective on this discussion, and potentially what the Jewish people, what was bothering them, what they were complaining about. The way we could understand what the Jewish people were saying was, even if God's blessing and Moshe's blessing are all one and the same, it doesn't sound the same. And this is what they said. When God speaks to us, when God gives us blessings, we hear vastness. We hear greatness. We hear unity. We hear this vastness that's way beyond our realm. Moshe, when you speak to us, we hear the physical reality. We hear something that's more grounded. Ultimately, does it mean the same thing? Potentially. It could mean the same thing. God's boundless blessings are also tied into physical existence, and therefore also could be assigned a number in the billions. But when God says it, we hear vastness. We hear this unity that's beyond our realm. And when you say it, Moshe, we're hearing numbers. We're hearing just more discussion within our realm, and that doesn't satisfy us. We're looking for this transcendent unity. That's what we're looking for. This vastness, this boundlessness. That's what we're looking for. And when God says it, when God gives us a blessing, that's what we're hearing. And that's what we yearn for in our relationship with God. We want this vastness. We don't want to hear billions. Billions might be a large sum, but it doesn't give us what we want in our relationship with God. And that's where Moshe responds, you're correct. You're correct that there are two perspectives, and there are almost two missions, and I've been assigned my mission. Yes, there's the unity with God that comes directly from the mouth of God. God says a boundless number, or boundless without number. And you're hearing and feeling and experiencing something boundless, something transcendent. But me, being a leader from the human perspective, I need to tie that into the human experience. I need to connect that with the experience that we're familiar with. So one is a small number, billions is a large number. I need to tie it into the physical reality that we're familiar with, because that's my position as a leader. And therefore, the Jewish people weren't wrong, and Moshe wasn't wrong. And then this then gives us another perspective on that entire question. What was the utility of Moshe's blessing? According to this perspective, Moshe wasn't adding to God's blessing. God's blessing was that the Jewish people proliferate. And thank God we have, if you start counting all the generations. And we will even more with the times of Mashiach. And we have through good times and through the bad times. The very fact that we've survived is part of this blessing. And Moshe comes along and he's reiterating the same blessing that God gave. And it's nothing new. There's no new utility. Just that when Moshe says it, he's tying it into a reality we're more familiar with. He takes something boundless that we don't see an end to, that we don't have a number, and he gives it a number. He creates a vision that we could experience within our reality. And so that then answers that question of what is its utility, is that Moshe as a leader is fulfilling his purpose of tying the boundless experience of God in the reality as we know it. That being said, I believe this seamlessly will help give us perspective on the entire book of devarim. And let's take, for example, Shabbos, a mitzvah that's been said until devarim and is going to be said again now that we've reached devarim. The Jewish people, what they've told Moshe is, when God told us about Shabbos, we heard a transcendent unity. That's what we heard. We heard a day of the week that it's just us with God, and it's unity and it's boundless. And when Moshe tells us about Shabbos, we hear the limits, not just the limits. We hear the actual commandment. We hear we have to rest. We hear that we should make a kiddush. We hear that we should gather our family. We hear what we should do and what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't create a fire. We should rest. When Moshe says it, suddenly there's so much more attention to detail. And what's important for us to understand, and what the Torah is teaching us by putting devarim as one of the 5 books of Chumash, what the Torah is teaching us is that the Moshe perspective is not outside of Torah. That is the fulfillment of Torah. When Moshe comes along and tells us Shabbos, and we start understanding that we should rest and that we shouldn't light a fire, and whatever else comes along with the ins and outs of Shabbos, that is how we tap onto this transcendent unity of God's Shabbos. So even in Moshe's number of thousands, we have the boundless of God. It's just being brought to us in a way that we could grasp it. It's being brought to us in a way that we could hold on to it, that we could relate to it, that we could create it in our lives and experience it. I think moving forward, I think this was the perspective that I would like to give on the entire Chumash of Devarim, and this could be applied really to every element, every mitzvah that's going to be raised. I use Shabbos as an example, but where every mitzvah you have this balance, where there's the transcendent unity, the boundless, the way it sounds like it's coming from God, the way it's beyond our reckoning and understanding, and the way that Moshe then takes it and makes it relatable and says, yes, it's transcendent, but you need the small, not only the small, but the details. You need to be able to hold on to it in words and in realms that are relevant to you in order to experience the transcendent that's beyond you. So I think time-wise, we've done well. We're under the hour. I would like to conclude with a story. And as it relates to Jewish leaders and their place in all of this. And so this takes me to a story of the Rebbe, and a Jew, a very prominent Jew, potentially well known to those that are familiar with the Israeli politics, a Jew by the name of Yehuda Avner. And so he had worked with the offices of 5 different prime ministers over the period of 25 years in Israel. He started off as a speechwriter. He then ended up becoming a close advisor to many of these prime ministers. And he recounts that he would visit America very often on behalf of the prime ministers in order to go to Washington or whatever else was needed as an ambassador and someone who spoke a really good English. Again, which made him a speechwriter for the UN and moments like that when Israeli prime minister had to speak in English, he was the speechwriter. So he then was sent as an ambassador many times to America. And he said he didn't start off this way, he started off a little antagonistic, but over time, it sort of became common that whenever he would visit America, he'd stop off in New York and have a visit with the Rebbe. It started off at the behest of one of the prime ministers, but then it continued on his own, that he would go over, he would share whatever he could. Officially, the things that weren't confidential. At times he said he would share more than he should have, but with the Rebbe in the Rebbe's room, he would share what's happening in Israel and the ins and outs and the prime ministers and the way things are leaning. And he enjoyed these conversations. He always said he was so amazed at how the Rebbe was so well tied in and connected to the ins and outs of Israeli politics. But anyway, in one of his meetings with the Rebbe, he became comfortable. And in general, the Rebbe's meetings and audiences seem to have a way of making people comfortable. Also, it kind of threw you off guard. Generally, the meetings would happen somewhere between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. So sort of out of the regular schedule, especially that, people were used to in a formal setting, and you come with your guard and you're all prepared for a political discussion. You're coming at 2 a.m. the guards are down. You're in the Rebbe's room. The discussion's happening. And so anyway, in one of his discussions, once he's already very familiar with the Rebbe, they're very comfortable, and the idea of what a Rebbe is came up. And sort of he led the Rebbe on to speak about how the Rebbe sees himself and his position of leadership. And so he recorded this conversation, documented. He wrote about it later in the Jerusalem Post. And so the Rebbe said, the way I see my position for the Jewish people, he said, I need to use an analogy. He said, take a candle. A candle is the material is all there. You have the wick, you have the wax, the body of the candle, but it's not a candle yet. It serves no utility. It's not fulfilling its purpose. It's just there. It's taking up space. It's not really doing anything yet. In order for it to be a candle, there needs to be a flame. This elusive flame, the moment the flame is there, it brings together the whole picture. Now you have a candle. And the Rebbe says, the Jew, and the Rebbe quoted from the verses, but a Jew is a candle. His body is the wax. It's the form of the candle, and then the wick is the soul, because that's the part that's able to hold the flame of God. It's sort of the special material that's able to retain God's flame, but not always has God's flame shining, at least openly and outwardly. And so the Jew is there. He has the wax and the wick, but the candle isn't there. Hasn't all been tied together. The Rebbe said, I see that my place is to light the candle, is that the candle should be lit, and that the Jew should be fulfilled as a Jew with his candle being lit. The conversation continued. They discussed other things. Before Yehuda Avner left the audience, he referenced the conversation, and he obviously was inspired and uplifted, having been in the presence of the Rebbe. And he asked the Rebbe, he said, Rebbe, has my candle been lit? We've spent all this time together. Has my candle been lit? And the Rebbe said, I've given you the match. You have to light the candle. And that message, he was obviously extremely inspired by that message. He shared it on multiple occasions. He said it publicly. You could find it on YouTube, publicly available, him sharing this message during his public speeches. It was a message that he says stuck with him. But I want to discuss that within the context of what we're discussing of the Jewish leader. And that is the purpose of the Jewish leader, of a tzaddik, of someone who is able to guide us, someone who's able to give us inspiration. And we all have people to some smaller degrees, those who give us inspiration, those we look up to. Not necessarily a Rebbe, but those that we look up to for inspiration, those that are able to teach. And the purpose, the reason why there's leaders, Moshe's purpose was in order to take the entire Chumash until this point, which was full of the mitzvahs and full of God's boundless energy. It was full of this unlimited blessing. And the purpose of the leader is to give you the tools to tap into it, to take that fire of God and to light your own flame, to light your own candle, that you relate, you transcend your setting, the physical setting, and are able to transcend and live and experience the Jewish experience of being connected to God, of experiencing God's Torah, of experiencing God's mitzvah, of experiencing the boundless blessing within the physical realm as we know it. And that's the match that we then have to light and be aflame with that energy, with that unity, with something that truly is beyond our reckoning and understanding, something that truly is beyond any number. We will end with that. Very good. And thank you all.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you all for joining.
Very interesting.